Welcome to Episode 5. Today we enter the mathematical and devastating core of Keynes' prophecy. Chapter 5. Reparations, the demonstration of the impossibility of payment.
This is really the moment the whole narrative shifts. We've explored the theater of Versailles, the clashing personalities, the political compromises, the electoral pressures back home.
All the human drama.
Exactly. But Chapter 5 just strips all that away. It forces us to confront the cold, hard arithmetic. Keynes uses this section to prove pretty definitively that the treaty wasn't just poorly negotiated, it was economically suicidal.
Right. And we have to remember, Keynes was the primary representative of the British Treasury at these talks. He wasn't some outside critic. He was in the room. And when he saw the numbers being bandied about, he realized the Allied leaders were operating in, well, a complete vacuum of economic fantasy.
They were.
So our mission today for this deep dive is a rigorous one. We're going to use Keynes' own forensic accounting to analyze Germany's actual capacity to pay versus the absolutely colossal sums the Allies were demanding. We'll show you why that attempt was fundamentally doomed from the start.
And crucially, why this failure was structural and, you could argue, deliberate. Keynes viewed the ultimate reparation chapter not merely as some kind of error in calculation. He saw it as a policy that represented, and I'm quoting here, one of the most outrageous acts of a cruel victor in civilized history.
That's incredibly strong language.
It is, because he argues the entire system was designed not for reconstruction or for some kind of finite justice, but to extract maximum financial tribute from Germany year after year, potentially in perpetuity. It was all about establishing a long-term structure of unrelenting debt and economic control.
So it's the difference between collecting a legitimate, quantified debt for damages that were actually incurred and establishing a kind of permanent financial servitude through compound interest and impossible demands.
That is the perfect way to put it.
Okay, so let's begin where this initial distortion occurred. The journey from what was a legitimate, if massive, bill for damages to a debt that promised to crush an entire generation. It really starts with political expediency. Let's unpack this. What exactly was Germany originally obliged to pay under the armistice? And how did that figure just balloon out of all proportion?
Well, the initial contract was actually quite clear, and you have to remember, this was the foundation upon which Germany agreed to lay down its arms. The pre-armistice engagements, most notably President Wilson's note of November 5, 1918, stipulated that compensation was limited to, and this is the key phrase, all damage done to the civilian population of the Allies and to their property.
Okay, so when you say that, we're talking about specific quantifiable material damage, right? Like the destroyed infrastructure in Belgium and northern France, the loss of merchant ships because of the U-boats, physical property destroyed by bombs or invasion.
Precisely. A huge sum, no question, but a definite finite liability.
It was a contract.
It was a solemn, internationally agreed-upon contract. But as the negotiations progressed at Versailles, the political appetite for a much, much larger indemnity just became ravenous. The Allies, and this was largely driven by the specific electoral promises made by leaders like Lloyd George in Britain, they felt this immense pressure to deliver a bill that looked like it covered the total costs of the war, not just these specific damages.
They needed a legal justification then to demand more. How did they retroactively manage to include costs like, like the huge expenditures on soldiers' wages and family allowances? Those were clearly outside the initial civilian damage agreement.
They engineered a really profound legalistic loophole. It essentially stretched the definition of damage to the civilian population to encompass the expenses of maintaining and compensating soldiers.
Well, how does that even work?
They successfully shoehorned the payment for pensions and separation allowances into the reparations bill. That's the money paid by Allied governments to soldiers who survived, to the families of the dead, and to their dependents.
Wait a minute. Paying pensions to your own veterans is a fundamental cost of fighting a war. Every nation has to bear that. How on earth did they justify labeling that civilian damage?
The justification was tenuous and highly political. They argued that the injury or death of a soldier constituted damage to the family unit.
The family unit.
Which is a civilian structure. Therefore, the financial compensation paid by the state to that family unit was part of the compensatable civilian damage caused by German aggression. This completely transformed the liability from specific material damage claims, rebuilding a bridge or a house, into this vast, open-ended contribution towards the general costs of the war.
That's a catastrophic breach of the initial commitment. Germany surrendered on the explicit assurance that they would face no contributions and no punitive damages, including pensions basically forces Germany to subsidize the Allies' post-war welfare systems.
It was a clear violation of that international commitment. Keynes argued that the principled criterion should have been strictly limited to damages from illegal acts of warfare or direct physical harm to civilian property. By bringing in pensions, the Allies were claiming money that, while maybe necessary for their own budgets, fundamentally undermined the legal and moral foundation of the treaty. It moved the claim from reparation to indemnity.
Let's put some numbers to this ethical maneuver. If the Allies had actually stuck to the principles of actual civilian and property damage, what was the scale of the legitimate debt, based on Keynes' own estimation of the data he had?
Well, Keynes was very cautious. He admitted the data available at the time was inadequate, so his calculation was a necessary guess, as he put it, just to establish the scale of the liability. But he did work through the known physical damage claims.
Okay.
First, Belgium. Its claim held immense moral weight because it was a guaranteed neutral whose territory was violated. Keynes estimated the maximum legitimate claim for Belgium at about $500 million.
Huge figure. I mean, that reflects the utter devastation.
For France, the calculation was more complex. It covered the physical damage in the northern industrial zones, which Keynes estimated for physical destruction probably didn't exceed $500 million. But France also had claims for various requisitions, levies, U-boat losses. So taking all that into account, Keynes' total reasonable estimate for France was $800 million.
And what about Great Britain? Its territory wasn't invaded, but it suffered these massive losses at sea.
Right. Great Britain's claims, primarily due to the destruction of ships and cargoes by U-boats, were estimated by Keynes at around $570 million. And finally, for the other allies, Serbia, Italy, others who suffered lesser but still significant damages, he sort of lumped that together at $250 million.
So if you take all those figures, the claims based strictly on the promised pre-armistice definition of physical, civilian, and property damage, Keynes' total legitimate estimate for all the Allied nations comes to roughly 120 million.
Or just over 2 billion pounds. A staggering sum, but a finite one.
Okay, now for the contrast. That 2.12 billion figure is based on a quantifiable measure of destruction. What was the amount actually adopted by the Allies in the treaty, the one that included the pensions?
Well, that's where it explodes. That move dramatically inflated the liability. Keynes estimated that the total claim adopted would assuredly exceed 3 billion pounds, and would likely fall short of 5,000 million. 5 billion.
So they potentially more than doubled the legitimate claim purely through adopting this legalistic loophole designed to meet domestic political demands.
Yeah.
Or at least half the debt was based on a broken promise.
Exactly. And what made the political situation even more volatile was that this final massive figure wasn't even fixed in the treaty.
They didn't even name a number.
No. The Allies intentionally left the precise total sum Germany owed undefined. They deferred the calculation to the Reparation Commission to be figured out later.
Why do that? I mean, why not just name the figure if they were already inflating it so much?
Because the deferral was a political masterstroke. It was designed to keep the most voracious public appetites satisfied. If they had named a low, economically sensible figure, leaders like Lloyd George would have faced an immediate backlash. He'd promised his electorate that Germany could pay 20,000 million.
An impossible number.
Completely impossible. By leaving the figure open, they ensured the public cry of, "Make Germany pay the whole cost of the war," remained politically viable, even if the Treasury officials like Keynes privately knew the real capacity was vastly, vastly lower.
So they traded political peace for themselves in 1919 for guaranteed economic chaos in the 1920s.
That's it. They prioritized the immediate political necessity of appearing tough over the long-term economic stability of the entire continent.
Yeah.
The debt was inflated by legal subterfuge and left vague by political fear.
That sets the stage perfectly for the sheer magnitude of the problem. We have this debt of 3 billion pounds, potentially rising toward 5 billion, and the first immediate demand was for Germany to guarantee a down payment of 1 billion by May 1st, 1921. So that brings us to the next critical question. Once this colossal debt is established, what immediate liquid assets could Germany actually surrender right away? I mean, where did the creditors look first?
They looked everywhere, but primarily at the visible liquid wealth that could be seized and sold on the international market. We're talking gold, foreign securities, and physical productive assets like ships. This is the illusion of liquidity that Keynes sought to dispel. The Allies just imagined they could walk in and confiscate a war chest.
Let's start with the most liquid asset of all. Gold and silver reserves. What was the start of the Reichsbank at the armistice? And how did that compare to the immediate debt demand?
At the time of the armistice, the total gold and silver reserves held by Germany amounted to roughly 125 million.
Okay, 125 million. Now, compare that to the immediate demand for a guaranteed 1 billion down payment.
The gold reserve was tiny. It was less than 13% of the required first installment. Not the total debt, just the down payment.
And the situation was deteriorating rapidly, wasn't it? I mean, Germany wasn't just sitting on that cash.
Far from it. That reserve was being rapidly depleted in the immediate post-war chaos. By September 1919, the Reichsbank's gold reserve had fallen from 115 million to just 55 million.
Wow. And that reduction wasn't going towards reparations, was it?
No, not at all. That reduction of over 50 million was largely due to necessary transfers of gold to the U.S. and Great Britain to purchase essential food supplies for a starving population.
So that puts the gold situation in stark perspective. The gold they could have seized was instead being used to keep the population alive, which is, a critical necessity if you want to maintain any stable government capable of paying future reparations.
Absolutely. And Keynes makes a really insightful point here. These reserves, already depleted and serving a humanitarian purpose, were absolutely vital for maintaining Germany's remaining international credit and stabilizing its currency.
Of course.
If the Allies had seized that paltry remaining 55 million pounds, they would have completely destroyed Germany's internal credit structure. That would make long-term repayment, which required a stable autonomy, infinitely harder. It was a completely self-defeating move.
So gold was negligible and politically toxic to seize. The creditors then turned to the next most liquid asset, foreign investments and securities. Pre-war Germany was a global power. Surely they held vast foreign wealth.
They did, but by 1919, that wealth was largely fictitious or just unattainable.
What do you mean by that?
Well, any investments held in Allied territories had already been sequestered during the war. But more importantly, Germany held massive amounts of capital in territories that were now politically shattered or economically worthless. Countries like Russia, which was in the middle of a revolution, and the dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire.
How does political collapse make a security worthless?
If the underlying government or corporation ceases to exist, or if the currency becomes worthless, the security ceases to have any realizable value. Keynes gives this stark example of Austro-Hungarian securities held by Germans, which had a pre-war nominal value of about 197 million. In the post-war collapse, you couldn't find a buyer for those assets. They were just devalued, high-risk paper. The German government couldn't easily lay its hands on that money.
So even though the total nominal value might have looked great on paper in 1913, the realistic, liquid, saleable value in 1919 was next to nothing.
Precisely. Keynes estimated that after acknowledging private debts and the unsaleable nature of all the Russian, Turkish, and Austro-Hungarian assets, the total remnant of saleable, stable securities Germany could realistically convert into foreign exchange for reparations was only about 250 million.
And that's a speculative figure, but it confirms the scale.
Yes. It just confirms the tiny scale of actual liquid wealth that remained relative to that 3 billion debt.
So immediate, realizable cash assets totaled maybe 375 million combined, a tiny fraction of the down payment alone, and seizing even that would cripple Germany's economy. Yet the treaty went even further than just financial assets, didn't it?
Yeah.
It systematically stripped away productive physical assets.
It did. And in doing so, it set a profoundly dangerous precedent. The confiscations were sweeping, targeting the very engines of wealth generation. First, and most immediately, the German mercantile marine.
The commercial ships, the very things you need for trade, for earning foreign exchange.
Gone. The entire fleet was swept away. And not only that, Germany was then obligated to commit its shipyards to building new commercial ships for the Allies, up to 200,000 tons annually for 5 years.
Wait, hold on. So they lose their existing fleet, and they're forced to subsidize the expansion of their competitors' fleets.
Yes, a double injury. The cost was merely credited against the massive debt. They were forced to dismantle their current capacity to generate an export surplus and then dedicate their labor to reinforcing the competitive power of their creditors. It's hard to imagine a more self-defeating economic policy for a debtor nation.
It's staggering.
And then comes the truly revolutionary aspect, the violation of economic custom that Keynes saw as an immoral blow to global finance. The treaty provided for the wholesale expropriation and liquidation of all German private property, rights, and interests belonging to German nationals located in Allied territories and former German colonies.
We have to pause on that point. This wasn't just government property seized in war like battleships or state treasuries. You're saying this was the seizure of private citizens' property and assets without compensation.
Private property. This was unique in modern history. It violated the custom of 2 centuries. Allied governments, particularly those in control of former German colonies, were authorized to liquidate the land, the businesses, the personal assets of German nationals residing there, and the funds generated went directly toward the Allies' reparation account.
That just blurs the lines between the state and the individual completely. It's sending a message to the entire global economic community that if your country loses a war, your personal assets, your savings, your land, your business abroad are fair game for the victor, regardless of your personal involvement in the conflict.
It made property rights utterly precarious for the defeated. By seizing private assets to cover public debts, the treaty essentially treated the entire German population as a single, homogeneous entity responsible for the state's liability. The policy was less about immediate financial gain, though they certainly profited, and more about establishing absolute economic control over the nation.
So the summary of immediate capacity is devastating. Immediate liquid wealth was a drop in the bucket compared to the demand. Seizing that wealth crippled Germany's future credit. And the seizure of physical assets like ships and private property destroyed the foundational tools for long-term economic recovery.
Exactly.
This all confirms Keynes' central argument. The Allies were never going to be paid by seizing what Germany had. They could only be paid by seizing what Germany would produce in the future.
That's right. And that brings us to the greatest structural hurdle of all, the mechanism of transfer itself. What's so fascinating here is that the average person, or I guess the average politician back then, views reparations simply as a large tax bill.
Right.
They think, Germany has 67 million hardworking people. Surely, if they starve themselves, they can pay X billion over 50 years. But reparations are not simply a question of taxation. The German government could theoretically tax its citizens to raise billions of marks, but those marks are worthless in Paris or London or New York.
Of course. The debt was owed in foreign currencies. Gold, sterling, francs. So if I'm the German chancellor, I've got this mountain of marks from my citizens. But how do I actually convert that into usable foreign currency to ship to the Allies?
This is the transfer problem. And it is the absolute core of Keynes' mathematical impossibility argument. To pay external debt, a nation has to achieve a massive, sustained export surplus.
Meaning the value of goods and services Germany sells abroad, its exports, must substantially exceed the value of goods and services it has to purchase from abroad, its imports. And it has to do that year after year.
For decades. Let's use an analogy to make this crystal clear for everyone listening.
Okay.
Imagine the German economy is a massive factory complex. To pay its foreign mortgage, the reparations, it has to earn foreign currency. The only way to earn that currency is to sell products abroad. So if the complex produces 100 million units of goods, but it needs to import 80 million units worth of raw materials, cotton, wool, iron ore, food, just to keep its workers fed and its machines running.
Then its net surplus, its profit in foreign cash, is only 20 million units.
Exactly. And the reparations debt demands that that net profit, those 20 million units, be shipped directly to the Allies. So the German government takes the marks it collected through domestic taxes. It uses those marks to buy the 20 million units of surplus goods from its own factory complex, and then ships those goods abroad, or uses the foreign currency earned from selling them, to pay the Allies.
Which forces the German economy to live consistently below its subsistence level. Every single item exported is an item that is not available for domestic consumption or for the vital reinvestment needed to keep the factory modernized.
That's it. And here is the fatal paradox. The treaty simultaneously established this colossal debt, which required a massive, sustained export surplus, while aggressively crippling Germany's primary engine of production, the very machinery needed to generate that surplus.
The completely self-destructive irony.
Keynes dedicated much of Chapter 5 to showing how the treaty inflicted maximum damage on the industrial foundation of Central Europe, making that required export surplus mathematically unattainable. The clearest evidence of this is in resources, particularly coal and iron.
Let's look at the specific devastating figures related to coal.
Germany's pre-war industrial dominance was built on coal and iron. In 1913, Germany's total coal output was over 190 million tons. Domestic consumption alone, powering railways, factories, heating homes, for 67 million people was 139 million tons.
Okay.
The treaty immediately ceded control of major coal fields. The Saar Basin was ceded outright to France for 15 years, and Upper Silesia, a crucial industrial region, was placed under threat of being ceded to Poland.
And what was the measurable immediate loss in tons?
The diminution of German coal production due to the loss of territory was a staggering 60.8 million tons annually. That includes 3.8 million tons from Alsace-Lorraine, 13.2 million from the Saar, and a massive 43.8 million tons potentially from Upper Silesia, which was key for the Eastern industrial base.
So they lose over 60 million tons of the fuel they need to power their own internal economy, which cripples their capacity to manufacture goods, and yet the treaty demands they become a massive coal exporter to the Allies.
The demands were extraordinary. Germany was obligated to deliver huge tonnages to France, Belgium, and Italy. Initially, this demand was upwards of 20 million tons annually, rising to 25 million tons annually in subsequent years, specifically as compensation for French mines destroyed during the war.
Keynes argues that expecting Germany to physically and technically maintain such massive and unnatural coal exports after suffering that 60.8 million ton loss was simply impossible.
It creates an impossible zero-sum internal conflict. Every ton of coal delivered to the Allies means a ton of coal taken away from a German railway, a German smelting plant, or a German textile factory. If they fulfill the coal reparation demands, the value of their manufacturing exports, which earn the foreign currency needed for the rest of the reparations, has to decrease. It's a mechanism designed to force them to cannibalize their own ability to pay.
And this analysis flows directly into Keynes' evaluation of whether Germany could even ramp up its key export categories to generate the necessary surplus.
It does. Germany's economy was structurally dependent on importing raw materials, cotton, wool, iron ore, food, and exporting finished, value-added goods. The top 5 export categories in 1913 were iron goods, machinery, coal and coke, woolen goods, and cotton goods. Could they possibly increase these to earn the hundreds of millions of pounds required every year?
Let's run through his assessment. What did he think?
First, iron goods. Germany had lost significant iron ore resources and, critically, the coal needed for smelting. Keynes concluded it was impossible to increase the net export of iron goods. In fact, a large decrease was probable. They just didn't have the raw input or the fuel.
Okay, so iron is out. What about machinery?
While German manufacturing was sophisticated, expansion was limited by the unavailability of steel, the lack of coal for power, and just the general industrial instability.
What about consumer goods, woolen and cotton goods?
These rely entirely on imported raw materials. Germany had to buy the raw wool and cotton abroad, process it, and then sell the finished textile to earn foreign exchange. Keynes argued that a decrease in these exports was likely because Germany simply could not afford the necessary raw imports without the foundational wealth and credit to pay for them first.
It's a vicious, inescapable cycle. A nation without credit can't purchase the raw materials it needs to manufacture the goods it needs to generate the surplus to pay the debt.
Exactly. And finally, coal. While the forced deliveries increased the gross export tonnage, the pre-war net export value was actually quite small, only about 22 million pounds. So forcing those higher exports just guaranteed less fuel for domestic manufacturing, undermining the entire export structure all over again. The total export capacity of the entire German economy was nowhere near the required annual payment.
And now we have to put the crushing weight of the financial impossibility, the quantitative gap, into perspective. Even if Germany could somehow generate a respectable surplus, what did they have to pay annually, and what did that do to the capital debt over time? This is the mathematical horror story.
This is the most damning piece of arithmetic in the entire book. Keynes assumes a baseline debt of $3 billion, the assumed minimum target for the Allies. The treaty dictated a 5% compound interest rate on that entire debt.
5% compound interest on billions of pounds, and that is devastating even for a legitimate debtor.
Well, Keynes demonstrated that if Germany pays only $150 million annually until 1936, a sum already far beyond their proved capacity, that payment doesn't even cover the interest due on the principal debt.
It doesn't even touch the principal.
It doesn't even cover the interest. So because the payment falls short of the interest, the capital indebtedness, far from decreasing, actually rises dramatically. The debt would spiral from the baseline of £3 billion to approximately 10 billion pounds sterling in just 15 years. The Allies had inadvertently designed a debt schedule where the debtor had to make near impossible payments just to watch the principal debt more than triple. This is debt peonage on a continental scale. It guarantees eventual bankruptcy.
And the mechanism only gets worse after 1936.
Much worse. To simply service the interest alone on that projected 10 billion debt, just to keep it from growing further, Germany would need to pay a staggering 650 million pounds annually from 1936 onwards. forever.
650 million
Yeah.
annually, in perpetuity, just on interest.
Yes. Keynes concluded that a total payment capacity of 3 billion or even 5 billions is beyond reasonable possibility. It dwarfed any historical precedents like the indemnity paid by France to Germany in 1871, making the proposed German payment far more severe in proportion to their national wealth.
So the math proves the policy was an economic fantasy. Now we arrive at the logical, and I have to say, darkly humorous conclusion of the transfer problem, which Keynes called the boomerang effect. If, hypothetically, Germany could somehow starve itself and achieve this massive perpetual export surplus, what happens to the allies who are supposed to be the beneficiaries?
The only way for Germany to acquire 650 million annually in foreign exchange is by, in his words, flooding allied markets with goods. They have to export manufactured goods, machinery, textiles, chemical dyes, iron goods, all the products that France, Britain, and Italy produce domestically.
And they have to sell them at prices the allies couldn't possibly match.
Exactly, because Germany is operating under immense state-enforced pressure to export regardless of profit.
So the allies, having demanded payment to recover damages and protect their economies, would find themselves receiving that payment in the form of subsidized cheap German imports that directly undercut and destroy their own domestic industries.
It's the ultimate act of self-sabotage. This massive, forced German export surplus would inevitably lead to market disruption, widespread industrial damage, factory closures, and mass unemployment in the receiving allied nations. The politicians demanded indemnity to protect their jobs and industries, but the economic mechanism they chose guaranteed that those same jobs and industries would be destroyed by the very payments they insisted upon receiving.
So the policy was fundamentally suicidal for the victor's own long-term economic stability. It's an elegant economic proof that you cannot simultaneously demand impossible sums and protect your domestic economy from the consequence of receiving them.
As Keynes stated, the Allies sought to avoid industrial damage from Germany, but designed a policy that guaranteed they would suffer severe industrial damage from Germany's compulsory exports. The transfer problem guaranteed the chaos would spread far, far beyond Germany's borders.
So we've demonstrated that this entire reparations chapter wasn't just a political miscalculation, it was an economic death sentence for Central Europe, and a direct, quantifiable threat to the victors themselves through this boomerang effect.
It was an act of profound and self-destructive blindness that went beyond economics into the realm of national sovereignty. The economic destruction was immediately leveraged to undermine any chance of stable democratic governance in Germany.
Let's talk about that. The unprecedented power structure the treaty imposed, the Reparation Commission.
The mechanisms put in place gave the Reparation Commission extraordinary, unprecedented authority. It was essentially an international body empowered to act as both a party to the debt collection representing the Allies and the ultimate impartial judge of Germany's ability to pay.
It's the prosecutor and the judge.
It's the prosecutor and the judge. This duality of role is unheard of in jurisprudence and gave the Allies absolute control over Germany's economic destiny. And the Commission could dictate to the German government that reparations payments had to be a charge upon all domestic revenues, taking precedence over funding its own government, its own social stability, or the service of any internal debt.
So the Commission had total economic control.
Total. Keynes's analysis suggests that Germany was stripped of all rights and individuality, becoming nothing more than a mere trade concern placed by its creditors in the hands of a receiver. The treaty had, in effect, given the Commission incomparably greater rights over Germany's finances than the German emperor had ever possessed over his own subjects.
So the German Financial Commission's comments on the draft treaty at Versailles, which Keynes quoted, suddenly don't sound like hyperbole when they stated that German democracy was annihilated at the very moment when the German people was about to build it up after a severe struggle.
It was annihilated. Because the foundation of any stable democracy is national sovereignty and the ability of the government to manage its own economy for the benefit of its people. When a government's first duty, its top financial priority, is paying impossible tribute to foreign creditors, and it is simultaneously deprived of the means to restart the economy, losing its ships, its colonies, its coal, its foreign credit, what trust can the populace possibly place in that new democratic structure? The financial mechanism was not just flawed. It was designed to guarantee the failure and the popular resentment of the Weimar Republic.
And this inherent failure then boomerangs back to the creditors, which just confirms the self-destructive nature of the policy.
Absolutely. The Allies were facing the imminent bankruptcy of their largest industrial debtor, Central Europe, whose recovery was intrinsically linked to their own prosperity. The treaty provisions had, in Keynes' words, condemned inevitably to destruction a large part of German industry.
And if the industrial engine of Central Europe stalls, the whole continent seizes up. Keynes argued, looking beyond just German reparations, that the very existence of these massive inter-ally and reparations debts constituted a menace to financial stability everywhere. It created this giant precarious debt overhang that poisoned the well of international finance.
And we mustn't forget the political and social cost. The demand for perpetual annual tribute, paid year after year for 50 years, ensures that you are stoking ill will and international friction for decades to come, as Keynes states quite plainly. A debtor nation does not love its creditor. The policy guaranteed that the peace would be temporary, built on a foundation of resentment and impossible economic burdens.
The tragic paradox is that the policy prioritized short-term, politically expedient revenge, this fantastic claim for billions of pounds, over the long-term economic recovery and stability of the entire continent, including the Allied nations themselves. The politicians were blind to the basic economic principle. Wealth cannot be transferred if the physical means of production necessary to create that wealth are simultaneously destroyed and controlled by the creditor.
The policy ensured that German labor would fall short of the previous level, and that her ability to reach her former prosperity was permanently impaired. You simply cannot squeeze a lemon that has already been crushed and stripped of its ability to grow and produce fruit. What was required was reconstruction and rehabilitation across all of Europe.
It's just astonishing how little regard the Council of Four Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando had for this fundamental economic problem, even with expert advice available right there in the room with them.
They were profoundly distracted. Clemenceau was focused on crushing the economic life of the historical enemy. Lloyd George was consumed with the political necessity of carrying home a massive bill that would satisfy his public. And Wilson was obsessed with the League of Nations. As Keynes observes, it was an extraordinary fact that the fundamental economic problem of a starving and disintegrating Europe was almost impossible to raise to the level of serious interest among the four. Political expediency trumped expert arithmetic at every single turn.
The treaty, then, was not a guarantor of peace. It was a mechanism of economic collapse wrapped in the veneer of justice.
It ensured the destruction of the old European economic order. It guaranteed years of instability, inflation, and political extremism across the continent.
So we've rigorously analyzed the math and the mechanisms, and we've confirmed that the demands were fundamentally impossible to meet. But the consequences of proceeding anyway were far more severe than just failed payments. They guaranteed political and social chaos across the continent, directly fueling the very instability the Allies thought they were containing.
And this raises an important question, doesn't it? Given the level of detail and economic rigor presented internally to the Allied statesmen, men who had access to Keynes's data and the Treasury's own calculations, how did they, the ones who clearly understood the destructive consequences of compound interest and the transfer problem, how did they justify or allow this impossibly destructive policy to proceed, knowing the resulting chaos was guaranteed? Was it truly just blind political expediency, or was there a deeper, more cynical strategy at play regarding the maintenance of power and the suppression of an enemy?
That distinction between political cowardice and deliberate malice is a crucial thread we must certainly pull on as we look at the immediate aftermath.
Indeed.
Join us for Episode 6, where we will analyze Chapter 6, Europe After the Treaty, where Keynes lays out the grim prediction of the coming catastrophe and explains how the treaty ensured the destruction of the old European economic order.